They thought it would be easy, just another land grab. Another farmer too old or too tired to fight back. When the bulldozers rolled in and tore through my wheat field like it was nothing, they didn't know they were stepping into something far bigger than property lines. Because I'm not just some man on a tractor, I'm the one who still remembers the truth they tried to bury. And I've got the records, the rage, and 100 years of family legacy on my side. What happens next? It's not just a fight for land, it's a war for justice. And by the time it's over, they'll wish they'd never touched a single inch of my soil. Let us know where you're listening from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. I promise, this is one story you won't forget. It was one of those perfect Montana mornings, the kind where the sky stretches out like a painted ceiling, and the only sounds are the breeze cutting across the pasture and the occasional cluck from the hens near the barn. I had just poured myself a second cup of coffee and settled into the old rocking chair on the porch when I saw the dust trail rising in the distance. That was unusual. We didn't get many visitors out here unless they were lost or selling something I didn't need. As the vehicle got closer, I could tell it wasn't a neighbor's truck. It was a sleek, black SUV too polished for these dirt roads, tires too clean. It rolled to a stop at the base of my gravel driveway, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit, looking like he'd been dropped in from some big city boardroom. He didn't belong here, not even a little. He adjusted his cufflinks and started walking toward the house, careful not to scuff his shiny loafers on the gravel. I stood up slowly, setting my mug on the railing, and gave Bruno, my old cattle dog, a quick pat on the head. Bruno let out a low growl but didn't move. He knew when something didn't smell right. "Good morning," the man called out as he approached. "Mr. Dalton, I presume?" "That's me," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "You are?" He extended a hand. "Eli Harris. I represent the Oak Valley Development Corporation, acting on behalf of the Sunny Creek HOA. I didn't shake his hand. "You drove a long way for something, Mr. Harris. What's this about?" He smiled, tight and polished. "We're conducting a review of land use compliance for all parcels within the annexed range of Sunny Creek. I'm here to inform you that as of last month, your southern pasture falls under temporary HOA stewardship due to a zoning reassessment filed with the county." I blinked, unsure I'd heard right. "I'm sorry, did you just say my pasture's now under HOA control?" "Temporary stewardship," he corrected, as if that made it better. "We're planning a nature retreat and meditation grounds as part of the Phase 2 development initiative, and our surveys show your land falls within the designated public use corridor." I couldn't help but laugh short and sharp. "Son, this land has been in my family since 1899. I've got deeds older than that suit you're wearing." "I understand this may be unexpected," he said, unfazed. "But our team worked closely with the zoning board, and all permits were approved. There may have been a lapse in documentation during prior ownership transfers, which opened the door to reassignment. We're here to ensure all land is utilized according to current municipal standards." "Lapse in documentation?" I repeated, now feeling the heat rise in my chest. "There hasn't been a lapse in anything. This land's mine. Every fence post, every blade of wheat, every damn rock." Eli glanced down at his clipboard, flipping to a page. "Your brother, Charles Dalton, appears to have signed a waiver in 2017 regarding rights to this parcel." I stared at him. "Charlie died in 2015. Eli didn't miss a beat. "Then it's possible the signature was a clerical error. Still, the paperwork is on file with the county." Now I was boiling. "Listen carefully, Mr. Harris. You don't step onto a man's land and tell him it ain't his anymore. That may work in whatever suburb you came from, but it won't fly here." He nodded, as if he'd expected resistance. "I'm just the messenger, Mr. Dalton. You'll receive formal notice by mail within the week. For now, I recommend you review your property records and consult with your legal counsel. We begin Phase 2 in 30 days. With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, not a single speck of dirt on his shoes. I stood there, fists clenched, watching him drive away as a bitter wind cut across the open field. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and I had a sinking feeling this wasn't the end. It was just the start. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying that smug grin on Eli Harris's face, like he knew something I didn't. After he left, I dug through the old filing cabinet in my study, hunting down every deed, survey, and boundary map going back to the Roosevelt era. I even found a 1941 newspaper clipping of my grandfather plowing the same field that Eli claimed the HOA now temporarily managed. It was all there, black and white, signed and notarized. But none of that helped me sleep any easier. The next morning, the sun was barely peeking over the mountains when I heard a deep, low, mechanical groaning coming from the south end of my land. Not the steady hum of a tractor or the whine of a combine. These were heavier, angrier. I slipped on my boots, grabbed my jacket, and headed down the gravel path toward the pasture. Bruno trotted behind me, ears perked, tail low. As I cleared the ridge and looked down at the valley, my stomach dropped. 3 bulldozers were tearing across my wheat field, carving thick, muddy lines through golden rows of grain. Behind them were 2 water trucks and a line of white utility vans, all marked with the Sunny Creek HOA logo. The lead bulldozer pushed right through my south fence, like it wasn't even there, splinters of cedar flying as the machine barreled through. I started running. My boots slid in the soft dirt, and my breath came hard, but I didn't care. I waved my arms and shouted, but none of the operators looked up. The engines were too loud. My wheat 4 months of work and half my seasonal yield was being crushed beneath steel treads. On the hill near the tree line, I saw them, a group of people standing around a folding table, sipping coffee from matching stainless steel mugs. They wore matching blue jackets, all embroidered with that damn HOA logo. And right in the middle, looking like she was watching a weekend lawn show, was a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair. I recognized her from a campaign flyer stuck in my mailbox a few months back. Clarissa Whitmore, zoning commissioner, the governor's wife. I stormed up the hill, mud splashing up my jeans. She noticed me when I was about 10 feet away and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Dalton," she said, like she'd been expecting me. "Good morning. I trust the noise didn't wake you too early? What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, pointing back toward the machines. "That's my land you're tearing up." "Actually," she said calmly, "it's currently under transitional stewardship, per zoning directive 184C. You were informed, were you not? Some punk in a suit showed up yesterday, waving vague paperwork and talking about temporary usage. I never signed off on a damn thing." She pulled a manila folder from a briefcase on the table and handed me a copy of the zoning reassignment. It had stamps, signatures, and a small county seal embossed in the corner, but the parcel number was wrong. The map showed a section 2 lots south of my fence line. They'd crossed it anyway. "You're on the wrong side of the line," I said, jabbing my finger at the document. "You're tearing into lot 27B. This says 27D. Clarissa took the paper back and adjusted her sunglasses. "Survey teams marked it yesterday. If there's an error, we'll handle it in post-processing. Either way, construction has already begun. You need to stop those machines. Right now." She turned toward the bulldozers and made no move to stop them. "Mr. Dalton, the HOA has spent millions preparing this phase of the retreat. Trails, gardens, reflective pools. It's all meant to benefit the community. Your crops will be reimbursed at fair market value. No one's trying to take anything from you." "You already have," I said through gritted teeth. Then I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff. I got his voicemail. I tried again. This time, he picked up. "Sheriff Kenner," came the familiar drawl. "Sheriff, it's Frank Dalton out at East Hollow. I've got bulldozers tearing up my field, trespassing on my land, right now. I need you out here." There was a pause, longer than it should have been. "I've heard about the dispute, Frank. he said slowly. The zoning office sent over documents. Looks like a temporary reassignment. No, it's not a dispute, I snapped. They're on the wrong damn property. They've destroyed at least 15 acres already. Well, look, I can come out later and take a report, but without a court injunction, my hands are tied. It's a civil matter now. I was stunned. Kenner had known my family for decades. He used to fish with my dad, but now his voice was flat. Careful. Fine, I said, hanging up. When I looked back toward the field, one of the bulldozers had hit a patch of irrigation piping pipes. My father and I laid with our bare hands when I was 24. The machine crushed them like soda cans, sending water spraying 10 feet into the air. Clarissa clucked her tongue. We'll have to assess for subterranean infrastructure. Might push the timeline a day. I took a deep breath, trying not to lose it. You have no idea what you're messing with. She raised an eyebrow, then smiled. On the contrary, Mr. Dalton, I know exactly what's at stake. And I suggest you lawyer up. She turned and walked back toward the cluster of HOA reps, already tapping on her phone. I stood alone on the hill, heart pounding, watching 600 acres of family legacy get ground into nothing. The worst part wasn't the machines. It was the feeling in my gut that no one was coming to help, and that this was just the beginning. I didn't go back inside after the machines pulled out. I stood there, ankle deep in mud, watching the water from the broken irrigation line pool around my boots like the land itself was bleeding. My wheat months of labor and planning lay in torn heaps. Bruno whined at my side, unsure whether to bark or retreat. I couldn't move, not yet. My chest burned, not from the cold, but from the slow rising realization that this wasn't some accidental overreach or minor zoning screw-up. No, this was a coordinated strike. By the time the sun reached its peak, I forced myself back into the house. My hands were shaking as I reached for the land files again. Every drawer in my study creaked like it was protesting being opened so many times in 2 days. I pulled out everything: folders, maps, tax records, surveyor notes. My father had kept everything in order, color-coded and labeled in his neat, precise handwriting. Even the earliest documents from my great-grandfather were here, preserved in plastic sleeves, faded but legible. And right there, filed under MISC, boundaries, was something I hadn't noticed before. A signed statement from a county registrar in 1952 verifying the official property lines for our family's original purchase, and it directly contradicted the boundary lines the HOA claimed. I studied the topographical layout, comparing it to the map Clarissa handed me that morning. Sure enough, they were using a revised boundary, one that cut a clean 20-acre slice off the southern pasture. But that revision had no seal, no registrar's name. It looked official, but it wasn't filed properly. Something was off. That's when I called Lucille. Lucille Bennett had worked as the county clerk for 30 years before retiring last spring. We'd known each other since junior high. If anyone could spot a phony land record, it was her. I told her what had happened and what I'd found. "Bring it all down here," she said. "I'm at the house. And Frank, bring copies, not the originals. If something's happening, we need to play it smart." I spent the next hour scanning documents into my old desktop. The machine wheezed like it hadn't been used in months, but it got the job done. By the time I pulled into Lucille's gravel driveway, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the pine trees lining her front yard. She met me at the door with a look on her face that said she wasn't surprised. Not even a little. They've been trying something shady since the county let that corporate board buy out Sunny Creek HOA, she said, ushering me inside. "You're just the first one they didn't scare off." I laid out the maps and files on her dining room table, and she studied them with a magnifying glass and a muttered string of curses. She pointed to the signature line on the revised survey. "That's not one of ours," she said flatly. "It's formatted like a county seal, but that isn't our font. And it's not from our print system. Someone faked this." My stomach turned. She flipped to the metadata in the scanned files. "And look at this. The file ID says it was digitally submitted last month, but your parcel hasn't had any open filings since 2007. So they faked a document, got it in the system, and used it to justify bulldozing my land? She nodded. They probably pushed it through by greasing someone at the zoning office. Frank, this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I sat back, rubbing my face. Charlie's signature was on a waiver from 2017, I said quietly. But he died in 2015. Lucille froze. That's not just fraud, Frank. That's criminal. For a long moment, we didn't say anything. Then she stood up and walked into her office. When she came back, she was holding an old leather-bound ledger. This is the master plot record from when your grandfather's parcels were surveyed by hand, she said. Back when everything was still drawn in ink and pencil. She flipped to a page near the back and pointed to a sketched outline of East Hollow. My land. Every inch of it. There, she said. That line hasn't moved since 1901, and it damn sure doesn't match what they handed you this morning. I stared at the sketch, my pulse quickening. The truth had been right there all along, buried in history, buried in my father's filing cabinet. But now I had it. Lucille, I said, do you think someone at the county office helped them? I don't just think it. I'd bet my pension on it, she replied. And I have a feeling I know who. She walked over to her phone and started dialing. I'm calling Rick Thompson. If he's still got access to the zoning office's backlogs, we can figure out who's been approving these revisions. I stood there, the map still clutched in my hands, realizing that everything I thought was secure, my land, my history, my livelihood, was under attack. And not by neighbors with complaints about barn paint or noise, but by people in offices and suits using paperwork and politics like weapons. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I'd roll over. But they had no idea who they were messing with. Lucille's call to Rick set something in motion. He agreed to meet us first thing the next morning at the county building. I barely slept that night. Again. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by old maps and documents, flipping through each one like I might have missed something, a date, a name, a stamp that would make it all make sense. Around 2 in the morning, I went back into my father's old study. It still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and cedar. The bookshelf was cluttered with everything from old farm journals to county almanacs. But my eyes drifted to the framed painting of the East Pasture, Our Best Land, painted by a local artist back in the 70s. My father had always said it was more than art. History hangs on walls and hides behind pictures, he used to say. It sounded like nostalgia then. Now it felt like prophecy. I lifted the frame and sure enough, behind it was the wall safe. I hadn't opened that thing in over a decade. After fumbling with the combination my great-grandfather's birthday, I heard the click and pulled the door open. Inside, there was a small stack of black-bound folders, each labeled by decade. I grabbed the one marked 1960-1980 and set it down on the desk. The leather cracked when I opened it, releasing a whiff of dust and something like old paper and memory. Inside were documents I hadn't seen in years, handwritten notes from my grandfather, annotated maps, and an official county charter with a red ribbon seal. My heart thudded in my chest. And then I found it. A county water easement agreement from 1962 signed by a Judge William Whitmore. The name stopped me cold. Whitmore, as in Clarissa Whitmore, the zoning commissioner, the governor's wife. The very same woman who'd stood at the edge of my field sipping coffee while bulldozers ripped through my wheat. The easement declared that my family would retain control of Carson Spring and its adjoining water systems in perpetuity, so long as we maintained active agricultural use on the land. It granted access to the county water line that now served most of Sunny Creek, including their brand new development. Any violation of the terms would revert water access rights fully back to the Dalton family. No wonder they wanted my land. It wasn't about building walking trails or koi ponds. They weren't after the dirt. They were after the water. Suddenly, everything clicked. The strange push for zoning reassessment, the rushed bulldozing, the forged survey. They were trying to invalidate the easement by turning my farmland into unused or non-compliant property. They bulldozed it not because it was in the way, but because it was the only thing standing between them and full control of the spring. I copied every page of that folder, then locked it back into the safe. I didn't trust leaving the originals out anymore. When the county's against you, even your own home starts to feel like hostile ground. At sunrise, I drove into town with a stack of folders and a pit in my stomach. Rick was already in his office, tie loosened, a half-empty cup of diner coffee beside him. His eyes widened when he saw the paperwork. "Frank, I don't think you understand how deep this might go," he said as he flipped through the files. "This document here, it predates the Sunny Creek development by nearly 40 years. I know. And look at the judge's name." Rick paused. "Whitmore, are you kidding me?" "Nope. Great-grandfather to Clarissa. He certified the water rights himself. They knew exactly what they were trying to undo." Rick let out a low whistle. "We need to bring this to the zoning committee. Now." But before we could leave, his phone buzzed. A text. His face went pale. "What is it?" I asked. "They've scheduled a board vote at Sunny Creek tonight. Emergency measure. They're fast-tracking Phase 2. My fists clenched. "They're coming for the north pasture." Rick nodded grimly. "If we don't stop them tonight, you could lose the rest of your land by morning." I looked down at the documents spread across his desk. My family's legacy, our history, our lifeblood. And I knew what I had to do. By the time I left Rick's office, the air felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. The whole town seemed quieter than usual, as if the buildings themselves knew something wasn't right. I sat in my truck a while, staring out the windshield, watching people walk into the coffee shop, kids on bikes cruising down Main Street. Life going on like nothing had happened, like my entire world wasn't being carved up behind my back. I gripped the steering wheel hard and exhaled slowly. Then I pulled out my phone and called Lucille. She answered on the second ring. "I need a name," I said. "Who's pushing this through zoning?" There was a pause on her end, the kind that told me she was trying to decide if she should say it out loud. "Clarissa Whitmore," she said finally. "And it goes beyond zoning. She's chairing the new infrastructure initiative for the entire region." "Of course she is," I muttered. "It's more than that, Frank. Her family's company, Whitfield Holdings. They bought controlling interest in the Sunny Creek HOA last year, quietly, through shell companies." I sat back in my seat. "So it's not just Clarissa, it's a damn corporation." Lucille lowered her voice. "It's a land consolidation project. They've been targeting parcels all across the county. Yours just happens to sit on top of the water source they need." I could feel the heat rising in my chest again. This wasn't about aesthetics or community gardens. This was about control, about the most valuable resource in this county, water. It made sense now. They couldn't seize the spring directly. It was too well documented, too protected. But if they could prove my land was no longer functionally agricultural, if they could bulldoze my fields and argue abandonment, that easement from 1962 would collapse. And once it did, the rights to Carson Spring would revert and be up for grabs. I hung up with Lucille and drove back to the farm in silence, every bump in the road shaking my jaw tighter. I passed a freshly planted future site of Sunny Creek Wellness Retreat sign that hadn't been there the day before. My wheat had stood there 24 hours earlier. Now it was just dirt and a logo. Back home, I grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic. Dust swirled in the narrow beams of light, and the wooden steps creaked beneath my boots. At the far end, behind old crates and mildewed boxes of Christmas lights, was a heavy trunk that had belonged to my grandfather. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were stacks of papers tied with string, some faded and yellowed, others crisp like they hadn't seen daylight since they were filed. I flipped through them quickly, farm receipts, letters, grain orders, until I found what I was looking for. A leather-bound folder labeled County Survey, Original Parcels. I opened it, and there it was, a map of the region, hand-drawn and inked, with boundary lines marked in pencil. At the bottom was a signature Judge William Whitmore and a county seal pressed into wax. I stared at it for a long time. This man, this judge, was Clarissa's great-grandfather. He'd verified my family's ownership himself nearly a century ago, and now his descendant was trying to erase that history with forged surveys and corporate jargon. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window of my study, staring out at the moonlit fields, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The barn loomed in the distance like a ghost from the past, its old red paint fading but proud. I thought about my grandfather, who'd built that barn with his bare hands. I thought about my father, who'd taught me to work the land, to respect it. And I thought about how they'd both roll in their graves if I let some HOA-turned-corporate machine steal everything they'd built. They thought I was just some old farmer with muddy boots and outdated paperwork. But I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was defending my family's name. And by the time they realized what they were up against, it'd be too damn late. I woke up with grit in my mouth and a storm behind my eyes. I hadn't slept more than an hour, maybe two, nodding off at the kitchen table with maps, deeds, and photocopies spread around me like a war plan. The coffee I brewed at 5 a.m. was cold by the time I drank it at 7. But I didn't care. I wasn't thinking about comfort. I was thinking about revenge. The sun had barely cleared the tree line when I called Rick. I need everything you have on the Oak Valley development permits, plans, zoning board minutes, environmental assessments, the whole damn thing. That's going to take days, he said, his voice still thick with sleep. You've got until noon, he sighed. Give me 20 minutes to get dressed. I'll open the archive room. By the time I got to the county building, Rick had 3 boxes stacked on his desk. I didn't say a word, just nodded, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. We spent the morning combing through years of paper, blowing off dust, flipping through faded ink and forgotten loopholes. Around 11, Rick let out a low whistle. Frank, he said, waving a yellowed survey sheet, you're going to want to see this. He spread it across the desk and pointed to the bottom corner. This is the original land survey, your great-grandfather's master parcel map. See who signed off on it? My stomach dropped as I read the name, Judge William Whitmore, the same man whose descendant was now trying to bulldoze my history. He certified your family's holdings himself, Rick said. This map clearly predates any development. They don't have a leg to stand on. It felt like blood rushing to my brain. The full weight of everything settled into my bones. They'd known all along. They hadn't made a mistake with the boundary lines, they'd tried to erase them. I didn't say anything for a while. I just stared at the map, running my fingers across the thick paper. Then I stood up, grabbed the map, and stuffed it into a leather folder, along with the easement document and a few copies of the forged zoning request. They're holding an emergency HOA meeting tonight, I said. Rick raised an eyebrow. You're going? No. I'm going to crash it. Back at the farm, I changed into clean jeans, a flannel shirt, and my father's old Stetson. I wanted to look like exactly who I was, a man who worked the land, not someone who signed it away from behind a desk. I also made one more call, this one to Sandra Miller, my old college roommate. She was a lawyer now, and not just any lawyer. She fought corporate developers for a living. She picked up on the first ring. Sandra, it's Frank. Frank Dalton? Lord, I haven't heard from you in years. What's going on? I'm about to go to war with 200 angry homeowners and a corporate-backed HOA. She didn't miss a beat. Send me everything. I'll be there in 4 hours. That night, the Sunny Creek HOA meeting room was packed shoulder to shoulder with residents, board members, and investors. I slipped in through the back, folder under my arm. Most people didn't notice me, too busy sipping free wine and snacking on fruit skewers, like they were at some social hour instead of a hostile takeover. Up front stood Clarissa Whitmore in a navy blue blazer, her blonde bob still perfect, her voice smooth and practiced. As you'll see from the updated renderings, she said, gesturing to giant easels displaying glossy images of gardens and tennis courts. Phase 2 will enhance the community's green space and increase property values by 12 to 15%. Someone raised their hand. What about that farmer who owns the land? Won't he fight this? Clarissa smiled. Mr. Dalton's property was improperly surveyed decades ago. We're simply restoring what should have been corrected years ago. That's when I stepped forward. I didn't ask for the mic. I didn't need it. My name is Frank Dalton, I said, voice firm. And I'm the farmer you bulldozed. The room fell silent. Even the wine sippers paused. Clarissa straightened, hands clasped. Sir, this is a private HOA. I cut her off. Before you continue selling off dreams, let me tell you something. My family has farmed this land since 1901. My great-grandfather settled it. My grandfather broke the soil, and my father built the irrigation system. Your bulldozers destroyed. I stepped to the projector and laid the original survey map on the glass. This is the original county map, verified and signed by your great-grandfather, Judge William Whitmore. He personally certified the borders you're now pretending don't exist. People began whispering. I switched to the water rights document. And this, I said, tapping the page, is the 1962 easement agreement. It gives my family control over Carson Spring and the water system that feeds your development. If my land stops being agricultural, your access is revoked. You bulldozed my field. That violated the terms. Clarissa's mouth twitched. You're bluffing, she said. That's outdated paperwork. A voice from the back spoke up. No, it's not. Sandra stepped forward, legal pad in hand. I'm Sandra Miller, Mr. Dalton's legal counsel. We've already filed an emergency motion with the State Zoning Commission, and we've requested a temporary injunction to halt any further construction. Clarissa's composure cracked. You'll be hearing from our lawyers, she hissed. I already did, Sandra said. Whitfield Holdings LLC, right? That's your private company. You're not just managing the HOA. You're profiting from the land grab. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I stepped forward one last time. You thought you were dealing with just a farmer, I said. But what you really did was poke 100 years of history. And we don't go down easy. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could feel it in my bones. The fight was only beginning, but this time, I wasn't fighting alone. I didn't expect the fallout to be immediate. Most of the people in that HOA meeting had spent years sipping cocktails and signing petitions to ban porch swings and clotheslines. They weren't going to turn on their own overnight, but I saw it in their eyes as Sandra and I left the meeting. Uncertainty, doubt, and fear. Not just fear of legal consequences, but fear that they'd been lied to, manipulated, used. The next morning, I went into town for parts. The hardware store clerk, who'd barely looked me in the eye the week before, gave me a slow nod as I walked in. Rick had called in a few favors and gotten some of my replacement irrigation piping rushed from Billings. I loaded up the truck in silence, feeling that first small shift in the wind. Something had changed. That afternoon, Lucille stopped by the farm, her car kicking up dust as she pulled in next to the barn. You stirred up a hornet's nest last night, she said, stepping out with a folder under her arm. And I think it's just starting to buzz. She handed me the folder. Inside were copies of public meeting notes from the Sunny Creek HOA board going back 2 years' notes that didn't match what the county record showed. They've been holding off the book's votes, she said, approving zoning changes without proper notice, failing to record easements. It's not just unethical, Frank. It's illegal. I looked up at her. Think it's enough? She smiled. That tight, tired smile only someone who's lived through real battles can make. It's a start. That night, I called Rick and asked him to help organize a public town hall, not just a county hearing, but a true community meeting. We put out the word at the diner, the feed store, the church bulletin board. I even drove out to a few neighboring farms and knocked on doors myself. The folks around here might have stayed quiet before, but not anymore. Not after what they saw, not after what was done. By Thursday, the meeting hall at the courthouse was full to bursting. Farmers in worn-out boots stood shoulder to shoulder with suburban homeowners in golf polos. I saw faces from all corners of the county. Some folks brought their kids, others brought folders, but everyone brought questions. I waited until most of the crowd had settled, then stepped up to the podium. "My name is Frank Dalton," I began, keeping my voice level, clear. "And many of you know me. Some of you might even think this is just about one farmer losing some land." I paused, looking across the room, locking eyes with familiar faces and strangers alike. But this isn't about me anymore. This is about all of us. Behind me, Rick placed a county map on an easel, then overlaid a transparent survey showing the newly drawn Sunny Creek expansion zones. Gasps broke out across the room as people saw how far the lines stretched past my farm, past the bordering lots, creeping into areas no one had expected. "They've been slowly redrawing property lines," I said, quietly. "Legally on paper but fraudulently in process. Using fake signatures, backdated approvals, and closed-door meetings." Lucille stepped up next and detailed the discrepancies in public records. Sandra followed her, explaining the legal obligations for open zoning practices and how Whitfield Holdings had violated nearly all of them. "We're not just talking about bulldozing a wheat field," Sandra said. "We're talking about systemic abuse of power facilitated through private gain under the guise of public good." One woman stood up in the audience. Maria Gonzalez. I recognized her from the farmers market. "They cut off our water last week," she said, holding up a notice from the HOA. "Said the farm contaminated it. Told us we had to buy bottled water at $20 a gallon." Murmurs turned into angry voices. A man near the back, wearing a Sunny Creek sweatshirt, raised his hand. "My house backs up to Dalton's land. I got a flyer saying his non-compliant agricultural practices were lowering our property values. Turns out that was a lie too?" "It was," I answered. "And that's just the beginning." I turned to the projector and showed a document Rick had uncovered, a 1974 ordinance requiring any development in Oak Valley to preserve a 200-acre agricultural buffer around the spring. A buffer that the HOA's bulldozers had destroyed when they tore up my wheat. "They didn't just violate zoning laws," I said. "They violated a county ordinance that was put in place to protect your water, your land, your homes." By now, the room was electric. People were standing, talking, shouting. HOA members seated along the back row looked pale and cornered. Then, as if the evening wasn't charged enough, the back door opened and in walked Sheriff Kenner, followed by 2 deputies and a woman in a crisp state investigator's suit. "Sorry I'm late," the sheriff said, stepping forward, "but I've been reviewing a few things." He motioned to Rick, who handed him a binder. "This meeting is now part of an official county investigation," the sheriff continued. "We've received credible allegations of document fraud, illegal land seizure, and misuse of public office." Clarissa Whitmore, seated quietly in the 3rd row, stood up. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Do you know who my husband is?" "Yes, ma'am," the state investigator said calmly. "And if we find that he had any role in this, we'll know what to do." Clarissa looked like she might explode. But this wasn't her room anymore. The crowd wasn't with her. They were with us. The sheriff nodded to his deputies and they moved toward the doors. "We'll be conducting interviews," he said. "Anyone involved in Sunny Creek HOA operations, please stay behind." The rest of us stepped out into the crisp night air. I could hear people murmuring, hugging, making plans. Maria came up to me and put a hand on my arm. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton, for fighting, for not backing down." I nodded, too tired to speak, but grateful beyond words. Across the street, news vans were already pulling up. Someone must have tipped off the press. Cameras were being set up. I didn't care anymore. Let the whole damn state see what was happening. They thought I'd just be another old farmer too tired to fight. They were wrong. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. By sunrise the next morning, I was already on the phone with Sandra. The courthouse meeting had lit a fire, but we needed more than angry neighbors and leaked documents. We needed a legal fortress, something no HOA, corporation, or crooked official could knock down. Sandra was already 10 steps ahead. I want copies of every transaction tied to Oak Valley and Sunny Creek from the last 10 years, she said. Land purchases, permit approvals, water reports, zoning appeals. If a cat blinked at a filing cabinet in that office, I want to know about it. Rick had stayed up half the night scanning old files. By the time I pulled into the county building, he had 3 USB drives waiting for me and bags under his eyes, like he'd been hit by a freight train. "You're lucky I still like you," he muttered, handing me the data. "If anyone asks, I wasn't here." I thanked him and rushed back to the farm. Sandra was already waiting at my kitchen table, surrounded by folders, her laptop open and humming. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Frank," she said, "we're going to court, state court, possibly federal, depending on what else we find." She slid a document across the table. "You still have the original 1962 water easement agreement?" I nodded. "Locked in the safe." "Good. Because it's enforceable. And based on the wording, the moment they disrupted your active farming operation, they violated it." She pointed to a section marked in yellow. "See this? Agricultural use doesn't just mean plowing. It includes soil preparation, planting, and irrigation. You were in the middle of planting your next rotation, right?" 50 acres of winter wheat, I confirmed. "Perfect. That field was legally in use. They broke the law the second the bulldozer touched it." She clicked to another tab. "We're also issuing a cease and desist order. Immediate. No more bulldozing, no surveying, no property access from anyone associated with the HOA or Oak Valley development." I felt a rush of air escape my lungs. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. Not safety, but traction. "We're also going to file for a temporary injunction," she said. "That'll freeze all activity on your land until the court rules." I nodded slowly. "And what happens if we win?" Sandra looked up at me, her eyes hard. "If we win, they won't just pay for the wheat. They'll be on the hook for damages, legal fees, possible fraud charges. And depending on what's in those records, maybe even racketeering." I raised an eyebrow. "You think this is organized crime?" "I think this is a profit scheme hiding behind a garden sign," she said. "And I think they underestimated the one guy in this county who still remembers where the real lines are drawn." The injunction paperwork was filed that afternoon. We delivered it to the zoning board with a media packet, just in case any of them were considering brushing it under the rug. I also sent a copy directly to Clarissa Whitmore's office. No response, but I knew she saw it. That night, as I walked out to the barn, a truck pulled up the drive. I froze for half a second after all that had happened. Every vehicle felt like a threat, but then I recognized the shape of Rick's frame climbing out of the driver's seat. "I found something," he said. We went inside, the barn lit only by a single bulb swinging on a cord. Rick set a laptop on a stack of hay bales and pulled up a scanned permit file. He pointed to the digital signature at the bottom. "Recognize the name?" It took me a second. Then I did. "That guy retired 3 years ago," I said. "Exactly," Rick replied. "But this permit for Phase 2? It's stamped last month. Either he came back from Florida just to sign one piece of paper, or someone forged it. Sandra called it before I could. That's fraud," she said when I told her. "If it's linked to property acquisition or contract approvals, it's criminal fraud." Over the next 48 hours, the momentum shifted. Neighbors brought over copies of HOA letters threatening them with fines for improper mailbox design or fence paint color discrepancies. Turns out, the HOA had been quietly squeezing people out for years. Every time someone sold under pressure, the property went into a holding company, most of them tracing back to Whitfield Holdings. It was a squeeze and sell operation. Manufacture violations, drive people out, then scoop up the property at below market prices. What happened to me wasn't the beginning, it was the middle of a long con. Even worse, we discovered something else. Underneath the eastern portion of my field, the land the HOA had already bulldozed, sat a natural spring. Not just any spring, the primary underground water source for the entire Oak Valley region. In dry years, Carson Spring was the only thing keeping the county's water table from collapsing. I'd known the spring was there. What I didn't know was how valuable it had become. Oak Valley's development had already been straining the local water system. There were complaints every summer: low pressure, dry taps, restrictions on outdoor use. And now, I understood why they were desperate. That spring wasn't just a convenience. It was leverage. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything. I printed out the geological survey and tacked it to the barn wall next to the easement map and the surveyor fraud evidence. My barn was starting to look less like a workspace and more like a war room. By the end of the week, Sandra had drafted the full case. The claim included environmental damage, trespassing, unlawful destruction of private property, forgery, fraud, and malicious abuse of governance. "I've filed civil," she said, "but I've also notified the state attorney general's office. If they find cause, they'll open a criminal investigation." I stared at the stack of paperwork, taller than a hay bale, and heavier than anything I'd lifted in a while. "Think we have a shot?" I asked. Sandra didn't blink. "We have the truth, we have the law, and we have the entire damn county watching now." Later that night, I walked out to the ridge above my field. The soil was still torn and bruised, but the air smelled like rain, and the horizon glowed gold under the setting sun. This was where my great-grandfather had stood when he first claimed this land. Now it was my turn to defend it. I wasn't just fighting to win, I was fighting to make sure no one ever tried this again. The storm finally broke on a Tuesday morning. Not rain, though God knows we could have used it. This storm came in the form of a text message from an unknown number. I was on the board. "I have proof. Can we meet? D." At first, I thought it was a prank. Another HOA stooge trying to bait me into saying something dumb or threatening. But something about the wording, the desperation in it, felt real. I replied with a simple question. "When and where?" The answer came quickly. "Noon. The old grain silo near Miller Creek Road. Alone." I parked a quarter-mile away and walked the rest of the way in. The silo had been abandoned for years, no cameras, no HOA patrols, no nosy neighbors. Just rusted corrugated walls and the low whistle of wind across empty fields. He was already there, Doug Wilson, the vice president of the Sunny Creek HOA. I'd seen his face a dozen times in marketing flyers and homeowner meetings, always standing next to Clarissa Whitmore with that fake salesman's grin. But now he looked nothing like that. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and his eyes were bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. "You came," he said, voice low. "You said you had proof." Doug hesitated, then pulled a flash drive from his pocket and handed it to me. "Everything's on there," he said. "Emails, internal memos, scanned documents, all of it. The permits, the forged surveys, the vote manipulation hell, even the water rate scam." I stared at him, unsure whether to thank him or deck him. "Why now?" I asked. Doug rubbed his face like he could scrub the guilt off. "Because I didn't sign up for this. I thought it was just development, Frank. Some shady paperwork. A few fast-track permits. But when we started cutting water to families and torching barns..." He looked up, ashamed. "That wasn't what I agreed to." "So it was them," I said. "Clarissa, Whitfield Holdings." He nodded. "It goes all the way up. She's got lawyers on payroll, inspectors on bribes. And her husband? He's been funneling state funding into the HOA under community resilience grants. That money's supposed to go to disaster relief. She's been using it to buy land." I felt the blood drain from my face. "They're weaponizing the HOA," I muttered, turning neighbor against neighbor, creating violations, enforcing made-up rules to drive people out. Doug nodded slowly. "It started small mailbox heights, garden types. But when we realized your land sat on that spring, everything changed. I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked away. Back at the farm, I plugged in the flash drive and started going through the files. What I found made my skin crawl. There were emails between Clarissa and county officials discussing strategic relocation tactics for stubborn landholders. Minutes from secret meetings where they discussed how to declare properties abandoned without owner consent. And most damning of all, a contract showing Whitfield Holdings planning to sell a large portion of Oak Valley, including my land, to a multinational agribusiness company. It wasn't about the HOA. It never was. It was a land grab, a full-scale, state-backed, for-profit colonization of our entire county. I called Sandra. "We've got them," I said. "Every last one." That night, we organized an emergency town meeting. This time, we didn't do it at the courthouse or in the Sunny Creek clubhouse. We held it at the old fairgrounds, the last place in the county where the land hadn't been touched by HOA fingers. Hundreds showed up. Some came with pitchforks, not metaphorically. They brought their kids, their neighbors, and their anger. I stood under the open-air pavilion, projector glowing against the aluminum wall, and started laying it all out. "This," I said, clicking to a file, "is an email from Clarissa Whitmore to the county zoning board, asking them to approve a forged permit under a fake employee ID. This one here? It's an internal memo calling my field an obstacle to progress." I showed the water bills next. Maria Gonzalez stood beside me as we held up her $600 HOA water invoice, more than triple the county rate. Then I played an audio file recorded from the board meeting the night they voted to bulldoze my land. You could hear them laughing. "She's the only thing standing between us and the spring," one voice said. "Just mow it down." Gasps echoed across the fairgrounds. Then I pulled up the geological survey. The spring sat dead center under my east field. If they got it, they could reroute water to every house in Sunny Creek and charge whatever they wanted. "They don't care about the garden," I said. "They don't care about wellness centers or meditation trails. They want the water. They want the land. And they'll destroy anyone who stands in their way." Sandra took the mic next. "Based on what we've uncovered, Whitfield Holdings has committed multiple federal violations," she said. "We've submitted evidence to the state attorney general and the FBI. There will be criminal investigations." People started shouting, not at us, but at each other. At the HOA members, sitting quietly in the back. At their neighbors, who had once called them out for having the wrong trash bin color. The tension broke like a dam. Someone grabbed the mic and yelled, "They threatened my wife with eviction over wind chimes." Another woman stepped forward. "They made me rip up my vegetable garden. Said it didn't match neighborhood aesthetics." It kept coming, story after story. A wave of betrayal, grief, and fury. And in the middle of it all, Clarissa Whitmore appeared. Flanked by two men in suits and sunglasses, she walked right up to the edge of the pavilion like she still had control. Like she still believed no one could touch her. "You people are being manipulated," she said, her voice polished and fake. "This man is spreading conspiracy theories to distract you from his illegal land use violations." I stepped forward, holding up a document. "This is the original land survey signed by your great-grandfather. And this," I held up another, "is the easement you violated when you bulldozed my field. You didn't just break the law, Clarissa. You broke faith." She opened her mouth to speak, but Sandra cut her off. "We've also submitted financial records showing misappropriation of HOA funds to purchase luxury condos in Miami under shell LLCs owned by you." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Sheriff Kenner stepped out of the crowd. "Clarissa Whitmore," he said, "you're under investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful land seizure. We're going to need you to come with us." Clarissa turned to run, but two deputies blocked her path. In the distance, a little girl sitting on her father's shoulders shouted, "She's going to jail!" Laughter erupted, bitter and victorious. I watched as they walked her to the cruiser. She didn't look so polished anymore. But I didn't smile, because I knew this wasn't over. She was just the face of it. The real power was behind the scenes Whitfield Holdings, the corporations waiting to buy, the state officials who signed off. This was just a battle. The war was still raging. But now, I wasn't fighting it alone. I had a county behind me, and we were done being quiet. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, every bench filled, every aisle standing room only. News cameras lined the back, their little red lights blinking like unblinking eyes. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Sandra, hands folded, face calm. But inside, I was burning. Across from us sat the defense, Clarissa Whitmore, her posture stiff and lips pursed so tightly they could snap. Her lawyers whispered frantically, flipping through folders, trying to keep their ship from sinking. But it was too late for that. The judge banged his gavel once. The room fell silent. In light of the evidence presented, he said, voice steady and slow, including verified fraudulent permits, forged signatures, unlawful destruction of property, and systematic abuse of authority. Under the guise of a homeowners association, I find the defendants guilty of document fraud and illegal land seizure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clarissa stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "Do you know who my husband is?" The judge barely blinked. "Miss S. Whitmore, you are facing criminal charges. You will also pay a fine of $50,000 to Mr. Dalton for damages and submit to a full audit of all HOA financial activity over the past 5 years." She opened her mouth again, but he raised a finger. "And one more outburst, and I'll add contempt of court." Her shoulders stiffened. Her face turned the color of her lipstick. Sandra leaned over and whispered, she thought her name would protect her. I didn't answer. I just sat still and listened to the gavel crack again. Case closed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like flies on honey. "Mr. Dalton, how does it feel to beat the HOA that tried to take your land?" I looked at them, camera flashes popping in my eyes, microphones shoved near my mouth. But I kept my answer simple. This isn't just my victory. This is for every neighbor they bullied with, made up rules and hidden fees. Every homeowner they intimidated. Every farmer they tried to erase. It wasn't rehearsed. It was just the truth. Over the next few days, everything came crashing down on Sunny Creek and the Whitfield empire. Flyers started showing up in mailboxes, documents revealing Clarissa's luxury condo purchases in Miami and Aspen, all funded through HOA dues. The local paper ran a 4-page spread titled, "The House of Whitfield, Greed Beneath the Garden." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, I watched from my porch as a moving truck backed up to Clarissa's mansion on the edge of Oak Valley. A for sale sign had already been jammed into the front lawn. Someone spray painted the word thief across her mailbox. I didn't condone it, but I understood it. She didn't wave as they drove off, just stared out the window, eyes hollow. Her house would eventually sell for half of what she paid. The very next morning, the newly formed HOA board came knocking. Maria Gonzalez stood at the front, flanked by 2 others I recognized from the community meeting's real neighbors, not corporate plants. "We found out the truth about the water billing," she said. "We want to make things right." They handed me a proposal. Eliminate fake fines, cap water rates, reimburse families who'd been overcharged. I signed off on the new terms, but only after they added one more clause: no development could cross onto my land, and the Carson Spring would be protected in perpetuity. 3 months later, things had changed. The legal process dragged on for others. Of course, Clarissa and her allies were now entangled in multiple lawsuits, both civil and criminal. The state launched an ethics investigation into her husband's office. The FBI continued to audit Whitfield Holdings. But here, in our corner of Montana, life was slowly returning to something resembling peace. On a crisp Saturday morning, I stood at the edge of my eastern field, watching neighborhood kids plant sunflowers along the property line. A living fence, they called it, their idea, a symbol that something could grow from the ashes, something good. Rick stood beside me, sipping coffee. "You know," he said, Your grandfather would be damn proud. I nodded. He built this with his hands. All I did was keep it from falling. Rick chuckled. You didn't just keep it from falling, Frank. You reminded an entire town what being a neighbor actually means. That stuck with me, because it was true. For years, people had been afraid to speak up, afraid of fines, of losing their homes, of being seen as troublemakers. But once the curtain was pulled back, once the truth was out there, it became clear that we weren't the problem. We were the foundation. A week later, I got a call from the state attorney general's office. They wanted me to testify in the larger investigation. I agreed, of course, not for revenge, but because I knew how rare it was to hold people like Clarissa accountable. This time, someone had to follow through. That same night, I finally fixed the old wooden sign at the end of my driveway, the one with our family name carved into it, half rotted and leaning. I replaced it with a new board, hand-sanded oak, sturdy as hell. On it I burned the words, "This land was built on sweat, not schemes." Don't forget it. It wasn't poetic, but it was honest. The following month, our town hosted its first True Neighbors Festival, organized by Maria and some of the other residents who helped expose the truth. There were booths with handmade crafts, fresh produce, local honey, and live music from high school bands. People laughed. Kids played. No one mentioned HOA violations or mailbox heights. It felt like the town I remembered before fake gardens and fake governance. They asked me to speak. I kept it short. I fought for my land, I said. But what I didn't expect was how many of you would fight with me. Thank you for reminding me and reminding each other that we still decide what kind of place this is. They gave me a standing ovation. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just tipped my hat and stepped down. That night, as I sat on the porch with Bruno asleep at my feet, I saw something that made me smile. The community garden across the road, the one they'd tried to build on my field, had finally been moved. Not to my land, but to a donated lot near the church. And this time, it was being built the right way. Volunteers. Real approval. Kids pulling weeds, not bulldozers ripping roots. They'd planted a small bench at the center, with a plaque that read, "In honor of those who stand when others sit down. Thank you, Frank." I read it once, then looked out at the quiet fields, glowing under the moonlight. Wheat, already pushing through the soil again, strong as ever. This land had been bruised, broken, burned, but it hadn't bowed. Neither had I. And now, neither would the people who called this place home. They tried to erase us. Instead, we remembered who we were. And we damn sure weren't going anywhere. I've lived long enough to know there are things in this life that, if you don't stand up and protect them, no one else will. My land wasn't just dirt. It was memory, sacrifice, and legacy. When people came after it with forged papers, twisted rules, and power plays, I had a choice: stay quiet or fight back. I chose to stand, not just for myself, but for every person who's ever been pushed around and left voiceless. What I've learned is this: truth and perseverance are stronger than greed and deception. Age might slow us down, but it should never take away our fight. When we stand up for justice, integrity, and decency, we're not just honoring the past, we're protecting the future for those who come after us. And if you ever think you're too old to make a difference, remember I did, and so can you. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel. I've got more stories to tell, and we've still got a lot left to stand for.